Hi, fourth graders. In our reading lessons, we have been working on reminding ourselves of the many strategies that good readers use. And we have already learned a lot of these strategies when we were together at school, but we want to be reminding you to be using these strategies with your at-home reading as well. This week, we are shifting a little bit more into nonfiction with our lessons. And we know that not all of you have access to nonfiction books at home. On that very last day of school, a lot of you took stacks of fiction books home with you and chapter books, but we know that you might not have a lot of nonfiction books at home to use. So for that reason, this week, it might be the perfect time to use some of those online resources that your teacher has introduced you to or that you've already been using this year. Now, we as fourth grade teachers all might use a few different websites, so I'm just going to give you a few suggestions. But I know that like in my classroom, we also use Scholastic News, so maybe your teacher has some ideas that you could use for some of your reading lessons this week. So this first one is Epic, and my daughter Lucy uses Epic a lot in her classroom. And at the top, you can search for what types of books you might be interested in reading. So I just typed in animals, and you can see all the different options that popped up that I might read about. Another one that we used often in fourth grade was Readworks. Some of you used Readworks in your reading groups at school. And Readworks, you can also search for what topics you're looking for. If you're interested in animals or science topics, nature, inventions, weather. So you can search that right here in the box, and then it will bring up different articles that match the topic that you're looking for. So that is another option that you could use. Another option that we use in our classroom is ResKids. And I know that not all of you might have access to that, but this would be another great option to use if your teacher does have a username and password for you. In our class, I usually encourage students to be looking for books that fall between the levels of N to S. And you can actually, when you're in ResKids, you can narrow your search to nonfiction as well. So there's a little box that you can click, and then they will bring up all different options of nonfiction books for you. And I'm actually going to use a book from ResKids today, and this was found in the level S. So I'm only going to read just a couple pages for our lesson today, but you'll see in just a second that there's lots of chapters or sections in this book. So if you want to finish this for your reading practice today, you could go ahead and look for this in ResKids. So this book title is called Animals Feel Emotions. And on Monday in our lesson, Mrs. Bronkhorst actually reminded us about how we can preview a text before we read it. And one of the things that we can preview is the table of contents. So before I even start reading today, I can practice that strategy, and I can look at the table of contents page and see the different sections of this nonfiction text. And I can kind of prepare myself for what I might learn about in this book. So I'm going to click to the introduction, and we're going to go ahead and get started, and you can follow along with me as I read. Today, fourth graders, the strategy that we're going to work on is making sure that we keep our eyes on the text while we're reading. And then we stop, and we're going to practice retelling, maybe what we learned or what that section was about. So I'm going to show you and remind you how we did this. So I'm going to start with the introduction, and then I'll stop, and we'll pause and see once if we can maybe summarize in a couple sentences what we're learning so far. So introduction. Do you think animals are capable of feeling love? I am convinced that animals feel love, as well as many other emotions. Many pet owners and people who work with animals agree with me. However, many scientists do not go along with this idea. To them, what you and I consider animal emotions are really instincts. Instincts are built-in behaviors animals do without thinking that are designed to keep them alive. In this book, you'll read amazing stories about animals that I believe show that they aren't just behaving on instinct. The stories include tales of loyalty, friendship, tenderness, compassion, and parental care. As you read, think about how humans would behave in similar situations. When you finish reading, I'm convinced you'll agree that animals can and do feel love. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to go back to the page where I started reading the introduction. And I'm going to stop and ask myself, what have I been reading about so far? What am I learning about? So you might use some sentence starters like, so far, this book is about, or maybe a sentence starter like, I'm learning that. So based on these first couple of pages, I think the introduction is trying to tell us that this book is going to show us kind of how there's some different opinions on if animals have emotions or not. So it seems like people that have pets or work with animals believe they do have emotions, but scientists kind of disagree with that. And they think that these aren't emotions, they're just instincts. So it's kind of sort of this debate between whether or not they have emotions or whether they're just animal instincts. So I would stop here and I would grab a sticky note or use my pen or pencil and be writing in my reader's notebook. And I'm going to just jot down what I think this is about so far. So I'm going to kind of use some words to summarize those thoughts that I just shared with you. After I stop and jot, I'm going to keep reading. So I'm going to move on to this next section, and it looks like this section is going to be about elephants. So I'm guessing it's probably going to be maybe about an example of how elephants might show emotions. So let's read this together. Echo was the highest ranking female in a herd of African elephants being filmed for a wildlife movie. Soon after she gave birth to a male calf, it became clear that the baby was unable to stand. His front legs were bent at the wrist joints, and he couldn't straighten them. He kept raising himself up on his hind legs, but couldn't get his front legs to work properly. Echo tried to lift the calf with her trunk, but he simply couldn't walk. An elephant herd depends on its head female for leadership. It was soon time for the herd to move on to search for food, but the young calf would never be able to keep up since he couldn't walk. Echo didn't want to be separated from the herd, but she refused to abandon her new son Eli. Elephants can survive for several days without food and water, but it's a big risk to stay in one place for too long. Echo had to choose between the herd and her son. And again, I've read a couple pages, so that's usually the spot where I stop, and I'm going to kind of go back to that last page where I started reading, and I'm going to kind of ask myself, what am I learning about in these last couple of pages? How could I retell what I'm learning so far? So I think in this section so far, the author's trying to use an elephant as an example of how animals show emotions. So in this case, the female elephant, the mom, is kind of showing emotion because she's facing a choice of whether or not she should move ahead and lead her herd, right? Or should she stay back and help her abandoned son? And so she kind of has to make that decision. Does she stay and take care of her son, or does she move forward with her herd? And so, kind of like we as humans face decisions that we have to make every day, I think the author's kind of showing us this is an example of how animals have emotions. And we're seeing this in this mom elephant. So, I'm going to stop. And in my notebook, again, I'm going to kind of use some of those sentence starters to summarize what I think I've been reading about in these last couple of pages. So, I think this section is about, and I could jot some of those thoughts into sentences that I just shared with you. Fourth graders, I'm going to stop here in this book. And again, if you're interested in continuing to read this book, it's in ResKids. It's in level S, and so you can look for this nonfiction book if you're interested in finishing it. But today, fourth graders, as you move into your reading work, I'm going to first remind you of the strategy that Mrs. Bronkhorst talked about on Monday. So today would still be a great opportunity to be practicing that strategy because you're probably going to be starting a new nonfiction book or article. So you can preview it by looking at the titles and covers, the table of contents, like I did today, do a little picture walk or make predictions about what it's going to be about. And then let's move over to what we talked about today. Today, fourth graders, while you're reading, I want you to remember to read with your eyes on the text. And then stop and make sure to retell so that you can check for your understanding. And these are some sentence starters that we talked about that you can maybe use when you're trying to retell. So this book is about, or I learned, and notice that Mrs. Slotman stopped every couple pages. Maybe stop every 2 to 3 pages just to make sure that we're checking in on your understanding. So the last thing that I want to remind you of is to make sure that we're practicing this strategy while we're reading. Don't wait till you get to the very end of the article or the very end of the book. We want to be practicing this strategy as we're reading, so while we're reading. So today, fourth graders, I want you to practice this strategy and stop and jot notes in your reader's notebook, or maybe in a doc or on a slide, whatever your teacher has suggested as a way that they would like you to do some note taking. But this is the strategy that we're going to be practicing today. Fourth graders, make sure to check in with your teacher if you have questions about some online resources to use for nonfiction text, or you could use one of the options that I suggested you check out today. Fourth graders, off you go.